Hi, I'm Christine Herman of Herman's Quality Meat Shop in Newark, Delaware. Today we're going to be talking about beef brisket. Are you ready? Here we have a beef brisket. This is exactly how it comes off the animal, and it has been aged for approximately 2 weeks. I'm going to flip it over so you can see the bones as well, and you can even see some of the aging, some of this darker portions of the meat and the bones. And we are going to get started right away and show you how this is done. And barbecue season is all year long. If you are a fair weather barbecuer, then the spring and summer is your season. That's how I am. However, we have many customers that barbecue in the coldest and the rainiest of days. Not me, but that's okay. We are just happy that you enjoy your barbecue and your grill and the weather doesn't bother you. I'm pulling off some of the heavier fat, and there's actually a little bit of good meat in there, and I'm going to set that aside for right now. You can hear it funking over there. But that is where we get some of our trim for our ground beef, which is what makes our burger the best. Because not only is it from the brisket, but it also, our ground beef trim also comes from all different parts of the animal. So I'm going to take the bones off. Now that I've kind of given myself a flat surface to work with, that's what I did right there. And our beef is locally raised in what I'm going to say on the eastern northern quarter of the United States, basically Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York. And this part takes a few minutes because I'm literally separating the meat from the bone, and it's a little bit of a wrestle, but that's okay. I'm gonna win. You watch. Try this knife instead. Our meats, our cattle, are all grass-fed and finished with grain, meaning when they leave the fields at night, they're offered grain, and when they leave the farm to go to harvesting, they're always offered food and water, so naturally they can't be offered grass at that point. But they are always offered food and water. The brisket is actually the breast portion of the steer. A lot of people were wondering just exactly where that is on the animal, but that is where it is. It's the breast portion. And up until, gosh, I want to say maybe 10, 15 years ago, brisket wasn't that popular of a cut of meat. It was mainly used as a pot roast. And it wasn't until the whole smoking craze took over that brisket became very popular. And you can see here by this view how I'm just about ready to separate this bone completely now. And there you have. And for this sake of the video, I would go in between the bones like this and take out these little nuggets of meat just for a quick, and put this meat, after I trim it a little bit more, into our ground beef. Again, another reason why our burger stands out in flavor and quality. So now what I'm going to do is trim off some of the aging and trim off this other layer here And one trick that you should always know is you never, ever cut towards yourself. Notice I turn the meat around. Sometimes it feels like a natural response. However, you never want that 8-inch blade to be coming at you. Whether it's your hand or your side, your stomach, you never want that blade coming at you. That's not a good, safe thing. So I'm just going to trim this down. Take some of this beautiful fat off because you don't need it all. But we will leave some on. And brisket is a low and slow cut of meat. Because if you think about it, brisket, as I said, comes from the upper portion of the animal, the breast meat, which means it's going to be a little tougher. So you want to make sure you're either smoking it, again, low and slow, or cooking it as a pot roast in liquid. And that's when you do something like 325 with carrots, celery, onions, maybe a tomato or tomato base or a can of beer, or some other type of flavoring that you'd like, brown gravy, and roast it in the oven. There's a little section here that I'm going to cut off. You can see where we're coming from here. It's starting to take some shape. That's the pot roast version that's very popular. And usually when we do a pot roast version, we trim the fat pretty well because you don't need as much to preserve and protect the meat as you would if you were smoking it. And when you're smoking it, you want to keep about 1/4 of an inch of fat on in order to protect the meat. And we're getting there. It's kind of hard to see maybe from your perspective. But what I like to do always is do what we call face it and just take that little outer layer off so that it's nice and fresh for you. And that gets tossed aside there. There's a piece of heavy fat in here we're going to take off. Kind of scoop it up. There's a second muscle to this brisket, and it's called the point. Most people like the flat, which is the main brisket itself, but the point is a second muscle, as I said, that lays on top of the brisket and is often used not only as an additional piece of the meat, but also is used for what's called burnt ends. And that's a whole nother recipe where you, after you smoke it, you cook it yet again. And we have a recipe here that we do, and we call it beef candy because it is amazing when it's done. So if you ever see that on our Facebook page, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. It's the burn ends from the brisket. So we're just trimming this up a little bit, taking some of this extra heavy fat because you don't need all of that. And there's gland here and there and blood vessel like right there that I'm taking out. Don't want that. Trim that down. So now we're starting to take some shape here. Doesn't take long. And now what I'm going to do is flip it. And here's the point. This particular brisket that I started with started out at about 23 pounds. And they can range up to 30 pounds with the bone in. And I'm just taking this outer layer of dry fat, which is just the aging off of it, which you have no use for. And when we're done, you'll see that this particular brisket will weigh in a bit smaller, but usually the larger full packers will end up being somewhere between 12 and 15 pounds. And you're going to be serving close to 20 people with that, just to give you an idea of how much you'll have with that meat. So we're going to just take this dry off like so. And as much as I love to show you this, I'm also taking it off because it is part of the aging process. So you know that our meats are dry aged and they're not wet aged. The difference being, and I'll explain this again in different videos, But the dry age process is something that takes place in the open air, in a refrigerator where the meat is actually hanging and it's not put into a plastic bag with liquid that's called the wet age. And you've probably seen wet aged meat in grocery stores and other places where you've bought meat before, where it's in a package and you can see the liquid. That's called wet aging. That has different qualities and purposes. 99% of my meat is dry aged. And you can see how the difference, how now that I've taken that layer off, how pretty that looks. And this portion again is the point. I like to just take all that off, always watching my arm here, as such. And pretty much, take that last little bit off. Get a little bit of a halo there. We'll sneak that off there. And that right there, my friends, is your brisket. And this is, as I said, a smaller brisket. So here's your point, and here's your flat side. And just for the fun of it, I'm going to put it on my scale. You may not be able to see me here do this, but I'll give you a hint. This one is small. It's just under 10 pounds. But what I want to do now is tell you that as is, it's your brisket with the point on it, your Packer brisket. I'm going to take the point off and show you what the flat looks like. And it'll just take me another minute. And I happen to know right where to score it. And we talked about the pot roasting method of cooking. And if you're going to be smoking it, easiest way to cook it is to put the fat side down, which is the other side. Fat side down. Well, let's start from the beginning. I apologize. You'll want to put a rub like this, some type of a rub that either you make or you buy, and kind of marinate it for a couple hours or up to 24 hours or so is fine. And then you want to put it on your smoker at a nice low temperature, somewhere around 160. And you want to smoke it for 4 to 6 hours approximately. 4 to 6 hours until the internal temperature is about 160 degrees. And then take it off the smoker and wrap it either in foil or brown butcher paper, which you can get at your local butcher. We always give that to our customers that buy a brisket from us. We're always happy to offer that for them. And then wrap it nice, and then turn your temperature up to about 225 and put it back on the smoker and for another maybe 6 hours or so. It is a low, slow process still, remember, until your internal temperature reaches somewhere about 200 degrees. And we've just pulled the point off. Voila, there's your point. And there is a nice extra little bit of fat here, which I'll trim down. So if you're not serving 14 people or more, you can just buy the flat and have plenty of meat without being worried about having way too much. Because leftovers are good, but sometimes they can be excessive. So I'm just going to trim this down a little bit more and show you what that looks like. Always keep in mind, especially with beef, you always want to cut against the grain of your brisket. That way it's nice and tender. And now, for example, I'm taking a little extra off. That's always going to go into our ground beef. Again, makes our burger the best. Did I say that already? Just kidding. Okay. So there you have it. There's your flat, your brisket flat. Pretty much right where we are. There you go. Voila, your brisket. And you can see the grain is going this way, so you're going to cut it, right against it that way, thin slices. And your point is there. And this is, again, something that we can use for something else, or the way it was laying on top, you would just take it off and then cut it separately, again, against the grain. And in this case, because the grain is going this way, you would cut it against it that way. So there you have it. Brisket, one of my favorites. All right, in talking about the brisket, I also want to talk about something else that's really important and near and dear to my heart for my kitchen tip, and that is contaminants. We're going to talk just briefly about some of the contaminants that you'll find in your kitchen, very unassuming, that you would be surprised that they show up, and at the same time you're like, yeah, of course. So the couple of them I have here, for example, are twist ties. Sometimes they end up appearing where you least expect them, like you unwrap a package and set the package, I did this the other day with my lettuce. I set the lettuce down and I started cutting up my lettuce and I realized that I had a twist tie on my cutting board. So you got to keep an eye on these little twist ties because they can get in the way. If you ever have a cut on your finger, you want to make sure to either wear a glove or take the Band-Aid off, because you never want to have that end up in your soup or your salad or wherever. I know that sounds gross, doesn't it? Two other unassuming places to find contaminants in your food are the bristles for your brushes that you use. These are very easily come apart that you don't always realize until you find them floating somewhere or on top of your barbecued meat. And that's not a good idea either. The other thing that I wanted to mention that I hadn't really thought about until the other day when I was cleaning my grill, and I'm a top to bottom person, so I was cleaning my grill from the top down, and I realized that as I was cleaning, there were these shiny flecks inside the body of the grill. I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what they are. Is that foil? Why would I have foil in there? And then I realized that they were remnants of the wire brush that I was using to clean the racks in between each use. And it made me think, kind of like my sponge story a couple videos ago, that maybe I should be more mindful about that wire brush that I'm using to make sure that none of those wires stay on the grate where I'm cooking. So just something to think about and keep in mind when you're grilling. And obviously when you're cleaning up your dishes, the same thing like with the sponge. You always want to make sure there's no remnants left behind or ending up somewhere that they shouldn't. But just keep that in mind, because you want to be safe and you want to be eating your food and not something else that you shouldn't be. So there's my kitchen tip for the day. Thank you very much. Brisket, my favorite cut of meat. Don't be intimidated by the size. Keep in mind, you can always buy a smaller portion. Just because it's 5 to 7 pounds or 14 pounds doesn't mean you have to buy the whole thing. You can just cut and get a portion of it. At our store, you can. And remember, the point, also very delectable. And don't forget a good barbecue sauce, one of your favorites, to go with your brisket. Remember to keep tight on your cleaning process in your kitchen and not to have any of those contaminants that are easily accessible in your kitchen as well as on your grill. I hope this was a great video. You enjoyed it. Please give us a thumbs up. Remember to subscribe, share it with your friends, and feel free to comment below. Thank you. Christine Herman.